To introduce Jacob, because we're in the middle of migration right now and enjoying it. Jacob Drucker is going to share some of the results of the dissertation research he's been doing to determine how the birds we're enjoying so much in Chicago migrate when they're in tropical climates and the paths they take to get here in both the spring and fall on the way to their nesting and wintering grounds. Jacob is currently a third-year PhD student in the University of Chicago's Committee on Evolutionary Biology. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree at Hampshire College, and he's been conducting fieldwork and outreach for different state agencies, nonprofits, universities, and commercial tour companies for over a decade. For the study he's going to tell us about, he's been working in Colombia, so I'm going to give him the floor so he can tell us about the birds we're seeing and what they're doing when they're not here. Jacob.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Rena. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming to hear about birds and how to detect them without our eyeballs, and what we can learn about migration from monitoring it with tools like weather radar and acoustic monitoring. So I'm going to share my screen here. Can everybody hear this? Hear me and see the main slides?
Yep.
Great. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about how we look at migration across both the northern and southern hemisphere in the Americas using remote sensing. And when I talk about remote sensing, I'm talking about things we can use to detect birds that aren't without us looking at them directly. Things like weather radars, especially, and microphones and recorders, so we can hear them and we can see the signal that they produce. And that gives us insight into these biological processes like migration that would be really, really hard for us to detect otherwise. And I'm going to start by talking about how these tools, especially weather radar, have changed the way we look at migration in North America, and then think a little bit about how that exacerbates what we don't know about what is happening in the tropics and how my research is trying to solve that problem. So I want to start off by thinking about the idea of a flyway. It's something that we hear a lot about and we see in the media a bunch. There are these migratory bird corridors that birds take. And in the US, we hear about the Pacific Flyway, the Central Flyway, the Atlantic Coastal Flyway. And we tend to visualize them in figures like we see here. Oh, I'm sure there's a reasonable chance that a few of you out there have seen this figure before. It's a beautiful figure, and it shows the path that different species have been estimated to take by tags or by banding studies or just by the incredible knowledge base that birders have about how and where birds move. But it kind of looks like these series of lines, and I like this nice horizontal view of Eurasia, of the eastern hemisphere here, because you can see where a flyway should be, where all these different species paths overlap, right? So you see there's a huge corridor of birds overlapping in the Middle East, trying to avoid the barriers that would be hard to cross, like the Sahara Desert, like the Mediterranean Sea, or the Tibetan Plateau. And so we have this, instead of a flyway being something where, a flyway is simply where birds are overlapping to take advantage of a given resource or to where to avoid suboptimal conditions. And so you can visualize it to some extent with a path like this, the paths we see here. But to me, a much more effective way to visualize flyways are with these maps. And so these are different figures from two different studies that show that the flyways in the US exist where the winds are most optimal for giving birds a boost, right? If you're flying all the way from Colombia to Canada, you want to have, you can make progress a lot faster with a lot less energy if you've got a nice tailwind giving you a lift. And so on the left here, we have a map of birds that are generally thought of as Eastern, birds that are just species that are really generally thought of as more central things, and birds that are generally more Western species. And the red is the fall here, the blue is the spring, and this map shows where the differences are most pronounced. So for these Eastern species that we have here, much more birds kind of follow the central plains up and come down in the fall. So there are much more birds along the upper Texas coast in the spring, and a lot more birds in Florida in the fall. You see that pattern's a little more pronounced here with these classically central species, especially in the spring. There are a few more birds that migrate up along Appalachia. And in the West, we see a really pronounced pattern where birds migrate up the Pacific coast in the spring and down in the fall. And this kind of classic, we can describe this as like a loop migration where birds kind of go in a ring. And that's because if we use this Eastern North America example here, there are these winds that the jet stream winds are set up so that there's this generally steady flow of wind coming up from the south that gives birds a lift, and they'll follow that up through the central part of the country. But in the fall, they can take advantage of these kind of prevailing series of westerly winds that come with cold fronts, and that brings those winds from the west, push them more to the eastern part of the country. And we can also see that a little bit in these measurements of where birds are flying, again, taken by weather radar, where we can kind of see that most of the birds are flying down here pretty low. This is a comparison of both spring and the fall between inland and coastal sites. And in general, we see that birds are tending to fly higher in the spring and lower in the fall, regardless of whether they're inland or on the coasts. And that's because there's more tailwinds that they can use at higher altitudes in the spring. So you would expect these flyways to be determined by where birds are finding optimal winds. And in theory, having a tailwind should really dictate where birds are concentrated and form these flyways that we get really excited about, especially now when it's migration. But if we look at a map of where all the wind is in the Americas, it's not equally distributed, right? And so in this map here, from this great website called earth.nullschool.net, I can put a link in the chat later if people would like to check it out. This was taken in, this video is from September last year, but even though it's September, right, you can see there's this airflow of wind coming up the center of the US that's beneficial to birds when they're coming from the south to the north, and kind of a pain in the butt when they're trying to move south. When in contrast, you've got these winds coming out of the northwest, so there would be a cold front right around here, and birds would be taking advantage of that in fall to ride that wind down to the coast. And that's why you end up with a lot of birds in the center of the US in the spring, and generally more on the Atlantic coast in the fall. But you also see a lot of wind in the Caribbean, the trade winds. You know, the European explorers used them to cross the Atlantic and end up in the Caribbean before they arrived in the US. And they kind of create something that birds have to navigate. They can be advantageous if you time your journey right. And I mean, these winds is how, if you're a blackpoll in September, a blackpoll warbler trying to get from Nova Scotia to Venezuela, you can see you've kind of got this nice boost all the way down. And so that's something that birds can make a huge difference in birds' abilities to cover these huge distances. But when they get to South America, you can see that all they've got waiting for them is not a lot of rain, not a lot of wind, and a bunch of rain. These kind of gray areas are clouds, with the blue and purple being precipitation. And so the birds, when they reach South America, lose the boost from these regional scale wind systems, and they have to confront these patterns of rain that are interacting at this really fine scale with the mountains in like the Andes in Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, which are ultimately their final destinations for a lot of species. But finding where you need to go, crossing these big tall mountains with a lot of wind, with a lot of rain, can be pretty risky business, and is something entirely different than what we're used to seeing with migration in the Northern Hemisphere. So going back to what the rest of the talk's going to look like, we're going to talk about how weather radars have changed how we understand migration in North America, and then we're going to talk about whether or not we can use that same type of data to look at how birds are migrating in tropical climates and what the challenges that are associated with that. And then we're going to talk about how to use these long duration recordings to look at these species-specific nocturnal flight calls to see which species are migrating, and use that to try and ground truth some of the radar data that we've been looking at. So first, it's important to talk about nocturnal migration. And for those of you who don't know, most of the warblers and landbirds and songbirds we've been seeing migrate during the night. And that's for a number of reasons. First off, there are fewer things trying to eat them at night, especially when they're flying up at 1,000 feet. And then second, the atmospheric conditions are usually a little bit more stable when you don't have heat from the radiation from the sun messing up all these little wind vectors that rise up off the ground during the day. So you've got fewer predators, you've got a more stable wind, and also importantly, birds are constrained by when they can stop and eat food. These are diurnal birds when they're foraged and they're going out and about. So if they need to stop and refuel, they're going to have to do that during the day. But because so many birds migrate at night, it makes it really hard to detect them visually. You know, these pictures were all taken from the 9/11 memorial lights. But you can, and also from the top, if you're lucky enough to be on the top of a tall building during spring migration, you can get spring or fall migration, you can get really unique looks at these birds while they're actively flying. You need a crew to start doing that from the top of the Sears Tower here, but it also works from the Empire State Building in New York. Highly recommended if you ever get a chance to be on the top of the Empire State Building during migration. But it's an old problem that we have with new solutions like radar and also modeling. And so without actually being able to see the birds, we can use citizen science data like eBird to generate these maps that model where birds are during a certain time of year. And so this is one way we can get around answering the questions of what we can, when we can't actually see what the birds are doing. But we do know that people see the birds on the ground in North America in the summer, and in South America in the winter, and in Central America and the Caribbean in the times in between. For this example, we're talking about Swainson's thrushes, this really common bird that if you go out in any sort of patch of forest or park with some understory, chances are there'll be a Swainson's thrush in there right now. They're very common. They enjoy these beautiful mountain habitats and boreal habitats in the northern summer, and then spend their winter down in these cloud forests in the Andes. So they're really a mountain bird for a lot of the year. But these models are a useful tool, but to see where birds are going, and it's incredible that we can use these now and generate these with citizen science data like eBird. But it doesn't tell us how the birds are moving and what they're doing in between all these different stops. And even in South America, where we don't have quite as much data as we do in the north, and the landscape is so different, is different enough and heterogeneous enough that it's harder to make models. We need to use other things to understand how birds are actually moving between their destinations. And that's where weather surveillance radar comes in. So fortunately, the US has top of the line weather radars that send out a beam, and we're really familiar with them for their role in detecting and forecasting precipitation. And so this little line here is a cold front moving through in September. Again, we're using September as an example here. And so this is rain. That's a signal that we're used to seeing. But all these little blue blooms are actually migrating birds. And so the sequence that we're looking at starts at about sunset. So this is the end of the night, and starting about, this is the evening, and starting about here, you can see the whole center of the US kind of lights up behind this cold front in the wake of these northwest winds that pop up. And each one of those blooms is a radar detecting migrating birds around it. And so we can tap into this to quantify the biomass of birds and other flying animals in the air, and use that to make these pretty amazing inferences about where birds are migrating, why, and what risks they might face. So what can we do? What do we do with this data that we collect? We start out with this raw data, and then based on these raw values of how much stuff the radar is detecting in the air, we can figure out how we can get rid of the precipitation. Based on how fast they're flying, we can filter out insects, and we can come up with this estimates of each on a given night what the distribution of migration looks like. Here, things are flying more to the center of the country. Things are flying more from the northeast to the southwest here. Each night is different depending on what the wind conditions are, and that's ultimately what determines the structure of a flyway. And then if we sum each of these nights together and see how bright cumulatively these regions are, we end up with this total quantity of passage and the total number of individual birds that fly through a given region in a given season. And I just want to highlight that these beautiful slides were put together by my collaborator, Adrian Doctor, up here on the right. He's been a really fantastic mentor for me through this process. And if any of you are familiar with the Birdcast program, he's one of the main driving forces behind that. So thanks to him for a lot of his support and for his generosity sharing his figures here. And Adrian is also responsible for documenting this incredible decline in birds since 1970. This paper got a huge amount of press when it came out in 2019, the decline of the North American avifauna. And it found that since 1970, the US has lost almost 25% of its estimated avifauna. So almost 3 billion birds gone since 1970. It's a pretty dramatic population decline, and it speaks to how much we know about birds and how much we can know about birds relative to other organisms. And a lot of this decline is estimated based on breeding bird surveys, which some of you might be familiar with. So observers on the ground going out and recording what they see and where. And that is a pretty long-term data set that goes back to 1970. But since 1990, they were able to incorporate, which is how far the radar data set goes, they were also able to quantify the biomass of birds flying in and out of the US and looking at the net gain and loss there. And that's what this slide looks like. So here you can quantify the total number, if you, again, say starts August, September, October, November, and you draw an imaginary line across the northern US and the southern US, and you can say how many birds left the US, say on an average year, 4 billion, 5 billion, and how many birds enter versus how many birds come back, maybe 2 or 3, you can get, so you've lost a billion birds or so every year, which is, it's the standard amount of mortality that you get. It's really hard to be a baby bird, right? You have to fly from Canada all the way down to Peru in some cases. It's challenging. It's hard even doing it on an airplane, let alone self-powered. In addition to all the challenges they face now, with changes in the timing of leafing out and temperature change, but also obstacles like lights, landscape change, development, et cetera, et cetera. So you can map where the differences and where more birds are the relative difference in where more birds are coming back than left versus fewer birds are coming back. And that's what this map shows. And that's part of how we get the estimate of 3 billion birds lost since 1970. And then, as I mentioned earlier, some of you might be familiar with the Birdcast program, which takes this historical data set of weather radar and tries to see if you can predict the nights with a lot of migration relative to local conditions. And again, you're looking at the variables that are the best predictors are wind direction and also temperature. And that reflects both the atmospheric conditions that are helpful for birds to migrate in the direction they want to go, but also the cues that birds use to pick up. So in the spring, when it's really warm and the winds from the south, birds feel it. They say, oh, we got to go. And so this model can perform really, really well, especially in the east. Things get a little more trickier in the mountains. But this is a map of tonight's migration forecast, and it actually looks pretty good in Chicago. I think your walk tomorrow will be pretty good. Rain or shine, there should be birds with winds coming out of the south-southeast at a decent pace. The precipitation might put some things down. It's got a lot of potential. And this is great for us birders who want to know if it's going to be a fun day of migration, but it's also really useful for predicting which cities might experience the highest rate of collisions with buildings and cell towers and things that are a problem to birds. And so we can use this information to say, oh, well, if there's going to be might be a lot of collisions tonight, it might be a good idea to turn our lights out. So the Birdcast program also just the other week came out with this incredible feature where you can take the estimations that they do at a continental scale here and downscale it to what's happening at the county level. And so this is phenomenal. This is a screenshot from what this migration dashboard looked like. If you go to birdcast.info, you can see this forecast back here, and then on the dashboard, if you enter county, you can end up with a diagram like this, which gives you, if you log on at night, you'll see the estimated number of birds in flight. And if you log on during the day, you'll see the peak number of birds in the air over that county during the entire night. So this is the night of May 10th or May 9th, I believe. Yeah, night of May 9th. So it's starting from after sunset on May 9th to sunrise, just before sunrise on May 10th. This is the numbers you get. And so you get a total number of birds crossed. You get over 8 million birds estimated to have crossed Cook County, with 1 million in the air at a given time. But you also get to see how this night compares to other nights and to the norm. And so here, this first panel tells you the number of birds in flight total. And so this green line represents the change over time. And so 1.1 million is the max here. And so you can see at 9 p.m. there are a few birds, and it really peaks at about 2 a.m. before dropping off in the morning. And you can also see how fast they're going. So they're moving pretty fast. Like the top here is 55 miles an hour. So most of the night, these birds are taking advantage of these southwesterly tailwinds and moving up to 55 miles an hour, really fast for these warbler-sized birds. You can estimate how high they're flying. So this night, they were flying up to 3,000, so higher than average. These gray lines here show you the average across the year. So most nights, these birds will be flying about 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet. It increases after takeoff and gradually goes down. So on this night, the biggest of the season so far in Chicago, you get the same general pattern of birds flying higher earlier in the night, trying to find the optimal winds, and then generally descending by the morning. So we have total number of birds in flight, flight speed and direction, altitude, and then you get this really nice comparison of how this night is different from all other nights. And so this plot shows across the migration season the nights with a lot of passage. So I don't know if you guys remember, the weekend of April 23rd to 24th, there was a big push where there were 3 million birds in the air. So that's what this looked like. And then there's a little blips here in May, and the end of April and early May. And then all of a sudden, boom, you just get the right conditions, and you have a big night this night, the next night, and you can see things have kind of dropped back down again a little bit here. And you say, wow, has everything gone? Has everything passed through? We've had some 20 million birds pass through Cook County in the last few weeks. And so for that, we can see this total accumulation curve. Green is this year, and gray is the other year. So right now, we're up here, when in an average year, we'd be down here. So yeah, it looks like this big peak pushed a bunch of birds ahead of the usual schedule. But I think they can handle it. I think it's more or less within the range of variation we're expecting in terms of whether we get all our birds early in May, late in May, evenly across the month, or all at once. But it looks like we've still got a couple million left to go for the rest of the season. And then you get an estimation of what the most common birds are that you might expect to see. So that's really powerful, and we can use that to predict how birds might be affected by light. And this paper used artificial light at night to directly measure how birds are affected by lights. And so this is what's now become a classic study, where they used weather radar to look at how many birds were flying in the beams during the 9/11 memorial in Manhattan. And this is, even though it's pretty frustrating for the birds, it's this incredible spectacle to see birds migrating at night, where they're drawn to the lights and kind of circle around in the beams. So each one of these specks is an individual bird. And it's actually pretty fantastic that New York City Audubon has an arrangement with the memorial, where if there's more than if there's more than 1,000 birds in the lights in a 20-minute interval, they'll shut the lights off for 20 minutes. So that's great, because birds can really get disoriented and wear themselves out when this happens. So here, these figures on the right show you that when the lights are off, there aren't many birds in the lights, but when they're on, you get this big concentration. And so it's a really key example of how radar can be applied to help birds in this really unique applied situation. And we can use that locally here too, to see what corresponds with the number of birds that hit with McCormick Place. And as Chicagoans, hopefully a lot of us are aware of how Chicago is one of the, if not the most deadly cities for migrating birds at night. And that's because of our location, where a lot of birds are flying. They're concentrated in the lakefront. We've got a lot of surface area of glass and other hard surfaces. And we do have a lot of light pollution. And so McCormick Place is the site where Dave Willard at the Field Museum has been going out and collecting birds that hit the window every day during migration here for the last 40 years. And he's also been keen enough in the more recent years to record which lights have been on and which ones have been off. So this study tried to see whether there were more collisions based on whether or not the window was lighted, whether there was a lot of migration happening, and which direction the wind was coming from. And so this graph on the left here just shows each line is different here, and it just shows that on the whole you have more bird collisions in the fall than in the spring. And that's just because there's more young of the year in general. And then on the right, you have these plots that show that the more in each line is fall, spring, fall, spring, fall, spring. And in each season, the more lights you have on, the more collisions you'll get. The more migration you have on the whole, estimated from radar data, the more collisions you'll get. And the more westerly the component of the wind, which pushes birds up along the lakefront, the more collisions you'll have. So here, the radar is just a piece of the puzzle to solve this larger issue of how light pollution affects birds migrating at night and how at risk they are for colliding with buildings. And so when we look at the distribution of artificial light at night, or ALAN, as people like to refer to it in literature, we can see that in the grand scheme of where birds are in North America, we're really the center of the problem in the northeastern U.S. Chicago, the whole southern area around Lake Michigan really lights up here, along with the New England mid-Atlantic seaboard, Mexico City, of course. And South America, the final destination for a good number, some 60 to 80 species. It's not quite as intense as the Great Lakes or the Mid-Atlantic, but the places where, you'll notice that where all the big cities are in the Andes, and that's a huge destination for a lot of species. And it kind of sets up a net, kind of like a catchment net for birds that are, whether they come through Central America or have to cross the Caribbean, they're going to have to cross and interact with a lot of these areas with light pollution. And we really know nothing about what collisions look like in these major cities like Bogota, Caracas, Medellin, Panama City. Is yet to be really quantified in any way. So that's one of the big holes that we're trying to fill in. And that brings me to my study system, which is Colombia. So again, Colombia is situated right here at the northwestern edge of South America. And there's all sorts of ways you can get there as a migratory bird. You can follow a land bridge in Panama, or you can take advantage of those trade winds in the Caribbean to just rocket yourself across the Caribbean and cross a lot of water, island hopping through the Caribbean, perhaps. But once you're here, you've got these obstacles of the Andes Mountains, which, I mean, they're quite tall. Over here, over here and over here. The top peaks are between 14 and 18,000 feet. So they're a pretty serious obstacle. There's a lot of rain. There's a lot of snow, and even it's pretty cool. Some folks going out to survey a glacier on this mountain here. But they were going to see how far back the glacier had receded in the recent decades, and they found that kind of at the foot of the receded snowpack, there were mummified cuckoos up there. So these were migratory birds that had tried to cross the mountains, but got lost in the fog and the wind and the rain, and ultimately died and were mummified in the snowpack there, and then have been revealed by climate change shrinking the snowpack. So that tells a pretty incredible story of how these mountains present an obstacle to the birds. So we'd think that where the mountains are lower, birds would concentrate. So you might expect more birds at these lower mountain passes. You might expect more birds funneling down these major river valleys. The Magdalena River Valley runs through here. The Cauca Valley runs through here, but there's lots of other things birds could be doing. They could be jumping from Panama all the way across the Pacific into this Chocó region. They could be coming in via the Llanos grasslands of the Amazon. And that says nothing of the return journey in the spring when they're coming up through the north. And so we're using this network of weather radars run through Colombia. They're all quite modern, and some of us give us better access than others, but we're excited. But the network's pretty comprehensive. We've got them on this island in the Caribbean, San Andres. We've got them on the Caribbean coast. There's some in the Llanos, some in the Amazon, of course, some in the mountains and the river valleys. And so we're hoping to tap into this whole network. But for now, we're looking at these 3 stations that are run by the National Weather Service, essentially, the IDEAM, it's called. And they've been very generous with their data sharing. It's now all accessible to download and to play with online. And so we've got this station that's in this river valley, which kind of is the closest to where a lot of birds are coming in and leaving, and could detect birds moving around the Andes a little bit more. We've got one site out in the Amazon, and we've got one site out in the temperate grasslands. And so that's what those are the data that we're going to be comparing and looking at for the majority of the talk. And for this, the migratory bird diversity in Colombia is pretty great too. A lot of the cerulean warblers, something like 60% of the cerulean warblers in the world all winter on the east slope of the Andes in Colombia here. So it's an obligatory bird-friendly coffee plug. Upland sandpipers all winter in southern South America, and most of them funnel in through Panama here and have to cross the Andes somewhere. And then we also can't forget that there's birds coming in from Central America, like this piratic flycatcher. So not all the migrants are coming directly from the US, and there's even others coming from temperate South America that could be detected by the radars down here. Not too many of them cross the Andes, but there can be pretty big quantities of austral migrants from Argentina and Uruguay, Brazil, that spend the austral winter around Guaviare and Carimagua. And to give you a sense of what some of these sites look like, this site in this is the Magdalena River. the big river valley in Colombia. And so you can see the Andes in the background here, and this river that runs north-south. The city's famous for its oil refinery and is a big oil shipping hub, but that's why we have this infrastructure that we can draw on. But having this river corridor here potentially makes it a really important spot for migratory birds, trying to avoid these really tall mountain peaks and looking for good navigational features to follow. This is not my photo, but it gives you a sense of what the llanos look like. The llanos are in eastern Colombia and western Venezuela, and they're these vast grasslands and palm savannas that are subject to these seasonal flooding. So if you want to see the most scarlet ibis you've ever seen in your life, the llanos is where you want to go. And then finally, we have the site in the Amazon. It's right at the transition into the Amazon. I don't know if any of you saw that in the media. The last year, some folks had discovered these ancient cave paintings in the Amazon with that potentially showed these extinct giant mammals from the last ice age that were painted by people on the rocks, and that's in this rock formation, the Serenia de la Lindosa, which was fortunate enough to be one of my field sites where we put out some microphones. But this is the view from up there, and you get but there's a major river that runs through the area, again, kind of highlighting the importance of rivers. But the landscapes and the geography in each region is pretty different. So they could be used by birds in different ways. And again, this is kind of how we get the measurements that we get. We start out with a weather radar that measures the total volume of stuff it detects. So reflectivity is the jargon there. The radar sends out a beam, which hits an object, which bounces a signal back to the radar, which tells you how much stuff that beam detected. And then you can detect how quickly the detected material is moving towards the radar in blue or away from it in red. And then you can use that to see the distribution of things in space and calculate the density of animals flying across time. So this is a snapshot of animals flying in the sky at night. You've got a layer close to the ground, you've got a layer further away from the ground, and you've got a third layer, and they're all flying. Each one of these little bars is 5 knots. So they're flying pretty fast from the northwest for the most part, with the most animals close to the ground. And then you can kind of take the estimated numbers in each one of these cells and calculate, just like we saw on that birdcast dashboard. You can estimate the number of birds flying over a region over a given time. And then you can take the total sum of this to get a single estimate. And that's how this birdcast dashboard works. And that's how we're hoping to quantify bird migration in Colombia. And this is kind of what that data looks like. It's not quite as clean and neat as we see in the US. It's a little more grainy out here in the Llanos, or out here in the Amazon. But you can see it's night here on the left when you get this big signal. So that's potentially birds migrating, along with maybe some bats and some insects. You see a lot of bright red actually during the day out here in the Amazon. And so we think that that's a pretty strong indicator that there are a lot of insects flying in the sky during the day, much more than we're used to seeing in the temperate area. And so this is kind of placing this radar imagery in perspective relative to the other radar sites where we could potentially analyze the data, and then also relative to the place where I've set up microphones to look at which species are migrating, because while this radar data is really good for looking at how much is flying, you can't say anything about which species are in the air. So we can break this down and kind of see what's going on at a nightly basis. Here we can see the top of this graph here shows that we would estimate that there's 4,000 birds per kilometer per hour flying over the Barranca Bermeja station in the Magdalena Valley. And you just like up here, you can see there's some nightly variation. There's kind of this baseline where things kind of peak in the night, and there's a little late afternoon blip. But these nights in late October, on October 13th, 14th, 15th, times when you might expect birds to be flying into Colombia from the US, about peak migration there, you get these blips of more migration traffic. And you also kind of see the signal of birds, which is that they're kind of their distribution across the night will change. And that tells you that they're kind of following the optimal air conditions for some wind assist. So in contrast, out here in the Amazon, we actually have a lot fewer birds. So here The top of the y-axis is 4,000 birds. On the top of the y-axis here, it's only 600, and it's a little more uniform. So you don't have as much layering in the air, and you don't have as many birds in the air. And they're all coming from a slightly different direction. Here, most of the birds between 1,000 and 2,000 feet are coming from the east. And over here, they're coming more from the north. And so that translates into coming into here and detected by the radar and coming over from here. And that, again, kind of corresponds with the prevailing wind patterns at that time of year. And also tells you that we might be seeing a lot more birds moving, funneling through the Magdalena Valley here than coming in via the Amazon. And this is here to give you a sense of what these different vertical profiles can look like. On the left, this is this is the filtered signal to just show what we think are birds. And on the right, this is what it looks like when you have precipitation in the mix. And so this is cool to me because both you can see where the birds kind of concentrate, or the birds or whatever's flying in the sky kind of concentrate and condense into a more concentrated area when they encounter precipitation. And so that tells you how birds are responding to their environment. It tells you that in an area with lots of precipitation, it might have this larger overall effect on where birds are flying in the sky. But there's a caveat, which is that we need to be 100% sure we're looking at birds. Because as you can see a little bit in the imagery from the Amazon, during the day, we're getting this really, really strong signal that's pretty consistent with insects. And the insects, needless to say, in South America are often a lot larger and there are a lot more of them in there are a lot more large insects in South America that fly around during the day. The llanos, the grasslands especially, have a locust problem that they're notorious for, which could be a really great application of the radars if we can figure out how to tell the signal apart. But between the insects and bats, it's signaled that all these models that have been designed to use in North America have never contended with before. And so as we look at all these results, we have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt and say, okay, well, there could be bats in here, there could be insects in here. And that's still kind of the frontier where we're at. And it's still a major challenge for us trying to tell apart what's birds and what's insects. But nonetheless, we can still compare the total flow of biomass in South America, which nobody's ever done before. So we're really excited about this. And we can see that you get a couple of patterns. First off, it's really key to look at the difference between what's happening during day and night. So all these columns, the panels on the left here are during the day, and on the right, it's night. And we can see we get more things are flying higher at night. We get more of them at night, and they're flying faster at night. And that's all pretty conducive to signal with migratory birds, but it happens all year round. So there's not just during the migratory period. So there's something going on that we need to look more closely at. And we also see that at this site out in the Llanos here, things are flying much higher overall. So likely the trade wind, they're following the trade winds out here are probably a lot higher than the rest of the country. And this is indeed the only part of the country of Colombia, that inland Colombia, that actually gets trade winds. So insects, bats, migratory birds are likely following that. And we're seeing that in our signal. We're seeing higher quantities of things overall, both in the day and the night in this Amazon site. And things are also generally faster there. And that's overall, as opposed to this single week in October. So for us looking for signals of birds, this specific week in peak fall migration is nice because it tells you that during migration, there are probably more birds over the valley. But if you go back here and look at the data overall across all the years, that signal's kind of overswamped by the general amount of things in the air over the Amazon. But there is a couple of videos that we've looked at, require some interpretation, of course, that do so show some clear bird signal. And so this little island here where the red dot and the radar is Curacao. It's a little island off the northern Dutch-owned island off the northern coast of Venezuela. And we're not actively analyzing data from here, but when we reached out to the weather agency, they gave us this 1 week of demo data, and boy, were we excited, because just to walk you through this. So this is the island with the radar in the middle. This bright green is some reflectance off the ocean. So that's all going to be there. But if this is, you can kind of see there's this little green fuzz that kind of creeps in off the Caribbean. It's right in the reflectivity values you'd expect for birds. And you can see them kind of make landfall here and peter out.
Wow.
And then in the evening, we'll wait for it again. So that's like a late afternoon arrival. I don't have the timestamp on these images, so you'll have to believe me, but you get, because there's this late afternoon arrival of birds arriving at the north coast of South America, finding places to roost, the afternoon settles in. And then over here, you get this departure of birds off Curacao and headed towards the mainland South America. So this is exactly like what you see of birds departing the Yucatan Peninsula and arriving on the Gulf Coast, where birders love to flock to see the fallout conditions of birds, of these huge numbers and diversity of birds making landfall after crossing the Gulf of Mexico. And this is the equivalent in South America. And so it'd be sure would be great to get more access to data like this, and even get into the field to see what it looks like when these birds make landfall, which local birders have seen it, and the reports are just fantastic, but I would love to see it myself. And so it's figures like this that really keep me going when it's a tough slog and we're not sure whether we're looking at all birds or all bugs or all bats. This is something that we're confident is bird migration, and really keeps us energized and motivated. So moving on to another type of remote sensing. When birds migrate at night, they often call to each other to tell each other, hey, the optimal wind is up here, or hey, there are more of us down here. Oh, the visibility's down, there's more light, I'm confused. And we can use these species-specific nocturnal flight calls to see who's migrating, as opposed to just and also get a sense of how many birds are in the air. And so I've been putting out these microphones and recording units. Here's kind of like the standard microphone in a bucket pointed towards the sky on this monastery above Bogota, up in the mountains. And so the idea is to set out these microphones and record who's flying and see how that, and look at which species are migrating in Bogota, up in the mountains, in the Magdalena Valley, and out in the Amazon, and see if the species are different, and see if the quantities of calls we get kind of correspond to what we think the quantity is based on the weather radar data. And so we were really amazed to find that in Bogota, most of the nights we found nothing, with a key exception of a couple of nights where birds were just going crazy. And so the peak call rates were like 4,000 calls per hour, which is just insane. A good night in Chicago, you go out and listen for flight calls, you might get a couple hundred per hour. So this is 10 times the quantity of a typical quote unquote good night of listening. And that's left us with this immense challenge of A, there are only a few nights where we get a lot of birds. B, the recordings aren't the best quality. The security guard at the monastery always had his radio on, so you've got a lot of background noise. And so we've been using a couple of different visualization techniques and a machine learning algorithm to pick out and identify the flight calls. So this is what your standard spectrogram looks like. You might have seen one before, where this is time over here and frequency, so high pitched, low pitched. And each one of these little smudges here, they look like little eyebrows, is a thrush call. So we've got Swainson's thrush, Swainson's thrush, Swainson's thrush, 90% Swainson's thrush, with a gray cheeked at the end here that goes down. But to kind of pinpoint the areas that are important and where there might be the most calls overall, we can kind of color code these different acoustic characters to different specific colors. And so we can then map that over longer time scales. So based on how much different types of sound is happening in a given time slice, we can color it pink. Based on whether the sound is really tonal, so it's like a whistle, or it's like white noise, that's spectral entropy. So if it's like white noise, it'll be bright green. If it's really pure, it'll be kind of a muted green. And then for the event count, it just tells you how many times there's like a little peak in there's a peak in the in volume. And so we can kind of move through and detect a little bit of the signal here. These are all the birds on this really busy night You can kind of see there's this little muddled, there's like this dirty muffled band over here, which is all the thrushes. In the dawn hours, you kind of get the dawn chorus from these rufous-collared sparrows. And a couple times throughout the night, this night, a beeper went off, and that kind of shows up here. Yeah. So again, you've got a lot of data and you don't want to spend hours sifting. We've got 600 hours of recordings for one mic in a given season. And so we want to hone in on the areas that we think might be most important. And so, but fortunately, the machine learning algorithms to detect and identify these calls have been in development for a long time, but they're finally starting to pan out, and there's ones that we can trust. And so it doesn't, the algorithm that I used isn't quite as good as the human ear. So here is, we can still kind of run the recordings through the algorithms, detect see how many thrush calls there are in them, and then compare between the sites. And so here we have the river valley, here we have Bogota and the mountains, and here we have the Amazon. And comparing these is a little bit like apples and oranges. I've just started to get the data from these. So in the river valley, we have 2,000 recordings that we're looking through. In the Bogota and the mountains, we have 500. And in the Amazon, we only have 23. So really only a night from the Amazon, but it's a good night. And so you can see from in the valley and the mountains, most nights, I mean, these boxes are supposed to be the mean, the upper 25%, the lower 25%. Most of the variation is happening in this box, and these are the outliers. So on this one morning, most of the calls were there were maybe 20 to 50 calls most night on most of the recordings from this night, but sometimes it went all the way up to 500 calls per 20 minutes, just the length of the recording. And but in Bogota, most of the time, and in the valley, most of the time you've got nothing, but every once in a while you've just got these crazy pulses. And that could be because birds are arriving from North America, or it could just be because those are the nights that are really foggy and birds need to call to each other more. So there could be nights with lots of migration and very little calling, and we wouldn't know the birds are there. But when we have nights like this, where our birds are calling, they're really key to hone in on and compare to the radar data and say, we know for sure that there's a really high volume of migration passage happening that night. And so we're hoping to use that to ground truth the data we're getting from the radars and be extra confident that we're looking at birds. But then also we found that this is the site where the Amazon site is. And this is a snapshot from that video we were looking at of Swainson's thrush distributions based on a model from eBird data. And so again, this is where Swainson's thrushes are projected to be in orange and purple in March. And they're really not projected to be very many of them based on the ground observations at this time and where this monitoring site is. But sure enough, the recording data says otherwise, that you get a whole lot more birds flying over this region than actually stopping. And so while the model shows that the thrushes are migrating along the mountains, in reality, there's probably a whole lot more movement happening over the Amazon than we'd think. And this is a giant black hole for radar data that they just start to get, and you just start to get into it a little bit here. But flight call monitoring stations could really illuminate what's going on in these remote areas where there is no radar, and then where there is radar, we can use it to say, oh, there's a lot of migration happening here, more than we thought, and more of these species like Swainson's thrush and gray-cheeked thrush. And then it's also kind of fun to highlight these Amazonian river corridors, which just like the Magdalena Valley, where one radar station is oriented north-south between the mountains. It's a nice place to go up and down latitudinally within Colombia. But this is a screenshot of birds kind of taking off in the evening. And you can see that the river really lights up. And I'm sure it's not all migratory birds, but there's probably a lot of swallow roosts that are there. A lot of resident water birds fly up and down the valley. But migratory birds do absolutely use these corridors. And so this is a picture from the plane leaving the city of Guaviare, where the radar and my microphones are. I have a microphone here. I have a microphone out here in these hills. But you can see there's this really kind of cool riparian corridor. The beaches there are actually pretty spectacular in the river. and they're home to these shorebirds that, that the same ones that we see up here spend the winter on these rivers or migrate and stop along these rivers. And so when I was down here in February, I was really excited to see these big flocks of buff-breasted sandpipers, which is, pretty uncommon bird in a lot of the US. I took this picture at Montrose Point, but these same two individuals that could have been hatched in Barrow or the North Slope of the Brooks Range in Alaska, and have been on their way back north along these beaches in Colombia. So just a really cool habitat to highlight, and that even though it's not this north-south orientation, it's still a really important region for birds moving through Colombia. So that's about all for now, but there's a couple of takeaways. I just want to emphasize that weather radars have completely changed the way we think about where, when, and how birds migrate. And that there's huge potential to really fill in these knowledge gaps of how those things are the same and different in tropical environments. There are significant challenges involved with interpreting this data. A lot of insects and a lot of bats makes a signal, and the lack of these big regional wind systems means that the bird signal is a lot slower, and that makes it harder to disentangle from the insect information. And then we can't emphasize enough how important these flight call stations can be, especially now that the computer software is good enough to really pull out the information, similar to what a human could do, but in a lot less time. And then, as always, the more we look, the more we'll see. And so it's really important to pour resources into expanding this monitoring network and making sure that the data is as good as it can be. So with that, I think I'm at time. I have a whole bunch of people to thank, academic committees, lab mates, collaborators, ground support, funding, and then photographers and artists whose work was featured here. So yeah, I'll turn it over to Rena, and I hope to answer some questions. Thank you.
Wow. That's a lot of information. And for someone who is really graph averse, I probably have to watch this a few times. You have so much data. Thank you so much. A couple of questions in the chat. Bob Stanley says, the weather radar shows discrete puffs of birds. Do they migrate in discrete flocks or rather as a continuous river?
So I would say that, let's see if you can go all the way back here. So so I would say that here's the raw data on the left here. And this figure on the right here probably displays what the movements actually look like. So the radar beam only detects things within like a 50-meter radius, and it's out at an angle. So if the beam is, let's see, I've got a fork right here. If this is the beam and it's rotating, and I have this data logger, and this is like the birds. It hits the birds at a certain distance, and so this basically just shows where birds are being detected around the radar. And so Birdcast and all the other research that uses radar data will kind of add a smoothing function to say, okay, well, if there's this many birds this far from the radar in these wind conditions, what is that going to look like over a larger area? And that's how you get these plots of kind of like a river and this flow of movement across the landscape.
I guess Bob was referring to the puffs as what's on the left. Okay.
So no, they're not necessarily as much in flocks and as much in flocks as they are in kind of these hot and cold regions regionally, at least in the US.
Then someone asked, how long has this kind of discrete radar been available to researchers, or rather over what time has it become sufficiently accurate to begin making these observations?
So the US database has been really workable since 1988 and has been extra good since 96 or something. Extra good meaning that the radars had, instead of having one radar beam they send out, there's that kind of that samples things vertically. There's another horizontal beam, and so you can get 3D visualization of precipitation. And then in Colombia, the radars were only installed, the modern radars were only installed in 2016. We started working with the data in 2018. And so it's been interesting to see how Colombia changes, it's how Colombia changes the type of data it collects as the years go on. And so we've been kind of, one year they'll do, every year it seems like they change the settings on their radar. And so we've kind of been playing catch up with how to interpret the data that they collect.
Okay. Bob Stanley also asked, when McCormick Place has so much a lower profile than the Loop buildings, why is it nevertheless still so lethal for birds?
It's really lethal for birds. I mean, it's really lethal for birds because of where it is right on the lakefront. If you're a bird coming in off the lake in Northerly Island, you go across, and it's right there. It's close. But the glass is also really reflective, and you have trees right along at glass level, and so birds come in off the lake. They see the buildings, they see the reflections, they see the lights, and they can hit. But in spite of papers like this, there's still a huge amount that we don't know about collisions and why they happen. So, for example, collisions can happen because of lights at night. In this figure here, they don't show anything about vegetation, and vegetation reflected in windows. So how reflective a window is can make a huge difference. Light makes a difference. So you can have different, the broad scale patterns of if you have a lot of birds on the lakefront, you'll have a lot of collisions in both places, is absolutely true, but the fine scale differences can be really hard to predict. But the other kind of key thing about McCormick Place and why it's so good for these published studies is because the bird collision monitors, I don't remember exactly when they started, maybe early 2000s, which is fantastic. It's, a couple decades. But Dave's been collecting birds at these windows since the 80s, and there's just no other data set like it that's as continuous and as long. So it makes it really good for comparing all the different things that could be affecting what's happening.
I want to know, you mentioned with the Curacao, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, the graphic, that you knew that those were birds and not insects or bats. I guess I missed why you knew that.
We know that because we know there aren't tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of insects flying in this direction out over the Caribbean. Okay. And there actually is a species of bat that migrates from the Lesser Antilles to mainland South America that could show up in this signal, but we wouldn't expect it to be that strong.
I wouldn't think so. Okay, there was one more comment other than a few thank yous, and this is from Carla. I did not know. Oh, well, maybe there's a couple more. Let's see. Okay, let's see. Well, Carla mentioned this, just so those of you who are aware of the Carvana Tower in Skokie. I was not aware, but according to Carla, that project is on hold. Do you know about that, Jacob?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So that's just news. I just did not know that. So, well, unless there's any other questions, I think we've taken enough of Jacob's time. Thank you so much. It was, as I said, a lot of information, and amazing that these tools can be used to interpret, the way what you're doing. So we look forward to more conclusions.
Me too.
Honey, you want to unmute everybody so we can all say goodbye? And there we go. I think he's unmuting. There we go. He's trying.
Okay. Thank you for a very good presentation. Very informative.
You.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Happy rest of migration, and I hope you're right about tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob. That was great. Great.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Good night, all. Have a good rest of migration. Happy birding.
Happy birding.
I'm going to sign off. See you guys soon.
See you all. We end the meeting. Stop recording.